Early in the morning, on November 27, 1989, a Boeing with 101 passengers and 6 crew members on board took off from Bogota Airport, heading for Cali. Just 4 minutes after takeoff, a large explosion ripped the plane apart at an altitude of 13,000 feet. Nobody on board Avianca Flight 203 survived that day. During the investigation, it became clear that the tragedy was not caused by a technical failure, but was an act of terrorism conducted by the Medellin cartel aimed at presidential candidate Cesar Gaviria. This was a shock even for Colombians who were accustomed to hearing about killings. A terrorist attack of this magnitude was something unprecedented. Blame for the attack was placed squarely on the heads of the cartel members, amongst whom was José Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, the man responsible for the military operations of the cartel. It may be hard to believe, but he was once completely different, capable of doing good for Colombians and striving for the prosperity of his country. So, what in the world could have happened to make a person decide to commit such an atrocity?
They only survive if you can anticipate detection before it even happens.
Rodriguez Gacha was born and raised in Colombia, near the small town of Pacho, in the department of Cundinamarca. Colombia was a poor country, and much of the population lived quiet, modest lives. This was also the case for Gacha's family. His parents were engaged in pig farming and cheese production, but for the most part, the family was also poor. His friends and acquaintances were of the same means. There was nobody to turn to for help, so Gonzalo dropped out of school just after the 3rd grade and began helping his family. As he grew up, Gacha moved to Bogota, where he worked at several different jobs, including a public transport assistant, a coffee picker, a grocery store assistant, and a waiter, where he closely observed truly wealthy people who were well-dressed, smoking expensive cigars, and ordering delicious and expensive dishes. Gacha also wanted to make big money, wear expensive suits, and make everyone around him jealous. When he visited his parents on the weekends, this desire intensified even further, as both his family and the residents of his beloved town were still living out a miserable existence. Gonzalo was too young and too stubborn to put up with this, and his youthful maximalism led him to Gilberto Molina, a man who was engaged in the search and extraction of emeralds. Molina was not one to refuse the offer of employment, so he took the young boy on board. The emerald mines of Colombia were, and still are, considered one of the richest in the world, and, given Molina's vast experience, things went uphill quickly. Gacha spent many years working different jobs, but in terms of income, this gig beat them all, including being a waiter. In the 1960s, a series of vendettas and disputes led to the so-called First Green War over control of the emerald mines. To strengthen his influence and power, Gilberto Molina enlisted the support of another emerald king of Colombia, Victor Carranza. This was a great duo, but there was one key difference. Carranza had armed guards, and Molina did not. In order not only to survive, but also to win the Green War, Molina needed people who were ready to kill. His choice fell on Rodriguez Gacha, a loyal, responsible employee with whom the Emerald Tycoon had an excellent and trusting relationship. But was he ready to kill? Gonzalo was no gentle, timid kid. After all, he grew up in harsh conditions, poverty, and understood that to get to the top, someone like him sometimes needed to go the extra mile. Undoubtedly, this was his big break, and he took full advantage of it. Becoming a hitman for Molina, Gacha helped him strengthen his position in the emerald business, and eventually rose to head of the security service. After a while, Molina and Victor Carranza took the young lad in on the business, increasing Rodriguez Gacha's income many times over. He had to kill, but this helped him achieve what he always wanted: respect and a lot of money. But Gacha was too enterprising to stop there. He longed for even greater success, and his choice fell on the drug trade, a business that, in his opinion, could bring in a lot more money and power. To start, Gonzalo decided to contact Veronica Rivera de Vargas, a pioneering drug trafficker known as the Queen of Cocaine. Gacha knew about her connections, and, after completing several assignments, she introduced him to numerous people, the most important of which were Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, a Mexican drug dealer, and Pablo Escobar, the man who changed Rodriguez Gacha's life forever. Escobar set out on the criminal path early in his his life when he was still only a teenager. He stole tombstones from the cemetery, erased the inscriptions, and resold the slabs for a profit. As an adult, Pablo became involved in smuggling, car theft, kidnapping, and, when necessary, murder. But comrades and enemies claimed that Escobar understood everything on the fly and had amazing business acumen. Outwardly, he seemed soft, modest, polite, and very proper. Escobar and Gacha both wanted the same thing: money, power, and respect. They also both had a passion for Colombia and wanted to help the local people improve their lives. On top of that, they were even similar in tone of voice and manner of speaking. Gacha made decent money from emeralds, but seeing the determination and intelligence of his friend, decided to devote himself entirely to the drug trade. They soon gained influential allies in the Ochoa brothers, who came from a respected ranching and horse-riding family, and Carlos Lede, a fan of Hitler and John Lennon, who spoke excellent English and had good connections in America. In 1976, they created the most famous drug trafficking team in the world, the Medellin Cartel. Before the creation of the cartel, Colombians bought cocoa leaves from Bolivia and Peru, processed them into powder at home, and shipped the resulting product north. However, by 1976, they decided to do away with intermediaries and sell cocaine themselves. By the end of the 70s, American tastes had changed. Marijuana gave way to cocaine, and increased demand caused a sharp spike in prices. In Miami, 1 kilo, 2.2 pounds of cocaine cost $51,000. The river of cocaine was constantly flowing and growing in volume as more and more of it was imported. The Florida Peninsula, with more than 12,000 kilometers of coastline, became a paradise for smugglers. At first, drugs were transported by hand, hidden in the secret compartments of suitcases, secret pockets, and shoes. This proved to be too cumbersome and did not yield the large enough profits that drug traffickers were counting on. Everything changed with the arrival of Lede, who proposed a much more attractive alternative by transporting cocaine on small planes. Together with his partner George Young, who not only gave him the idea, but also introduced him to major drug distributors in America, they began transporting hundreds of pounds of cocaine, and later tons. By the end of the 70s, Carlos Lede acquired land on the island of Norman's Cay, which was only 210 miles from Florida, which helped increase profits many times over, while also making drug transportation much easier and more convenient. From a handful of amateur smugglers, an international corporation was born that began to earn billions of dollars. Customs officials estimate that $3.2 billion unaccounted dollars moved through South Florida in 1981. Some people were arrested, but they were mostly small fish. The cocaine kings were holed up in Medellin in complete safety. At the dawn of the cocaine wars, conflicts between cocaine barons and representatives of justice were resolved privately. The police were bribed, and in case of arrest, so was the judge who presided over the case. To close the case, a major drug dealer would lay out a tidy sum of pesos, equal to 30,000 American dollars. Later, the rates grew to 50,000. If the judge did not take the bribes, the smugglers tried to intimidate him, or paid court clerks and stole the folder with the documents. If nothing helped, the judge was simply killed. Rodriguez Gacha's fortune grew rapidly and reached levels he had never even dreamed of before. But he, like other partners, was not going to stop there, and constantly tried to expand his business. Thanks to Gacha, new routes were opened through Mexico into the United States, most notably Los Angeles, California, Houston, and Texas. Trips to Mexico greatly influenced Gonzalo, and he grew to adore Mexican culture so much that he began to show his love for it everywhere. He listened to Mexican mariachi, began to wear a sombrero almost without taking it off, and had a large collection of them, decorated his houses in purely Mexican style, and even gave his newly acquired estates Mexican names such as Cuernavaca, Chihuahua, Sonora, and Mazatlan. He was a Colombian with the heart of a Mexican, and for his love of everything Mexican, the drug lord received a rather descriptive nickname, El Mexicano. Of course, rumors about wealthy drug traffickers quickly spread throughout Colombia, but no one wanted to challenge them, knowing about their connections, wealth, and armed guards, which were becoming more and more numerous. However, hopeless daredevils could still be found. One day, partisans from M19 decided to kidnap the sister of the Ochoa brothers, demanding a ransom. Oh, how badly did they miscalculate the arena. A friend in need is a friend indeed, and the kidnapping of Martha Ochoa truly was another step towards bringing partners of the Medellin cartel closer together. The drug lords were not going to pay the ransom, and, having found out where the partisans were hiding, carried out an absolute massacre. The surviving leaders of M19, whom the cartel did not manage to find, were so terrified that they returned Martha just 20 hours after the abduction, safe and sound. In addition, the partisans joined forces with the Medellin cartel to protect themselves from certain death. Their knowledge of warfare and guerrilla fighting would prove useful time and time again to the drug barons of the Medellin cartel. The operation to rescue Martha Ochoa was carried out impeccably, and Rodriguez Gacha, who had considerable experience in such endeavors and played a huge role in its success, allocating $500,000 for the formation of an armed detachment. Even though he used to kill under the leadership of the Emerald tycoon Gilberto Molina, it was perhaps after the kidnapping of Martha Ochoa that the drug lord showed a strong interest in military enterprises. He now had the resources, so Gonzalo became the main financier, organizer, and leader of the military wing of the Medellin cartel.
Emerald trade wasn't just about precious stones.
Strong, proud, and with a strong personality, Gacha was, as people described him, polite to those around him and merciless to those who were against him. He was very fond of wearing tennis shoes and short-sleeved shirts and always wore a sombrero. Having earned millions of dollars from the drug business, El Mexicano began to help ordinary people and bring Pacho, the place where he spent his childhood and still held very close to his heart, from its knees. Gacha began building schools, hospitals, residential buildings, hotels, and clubs, installed electric lights in areas of the city where there weren't any, installed running water, bought buses, and set up public transport. He did not shy away from sharing his wealth with people and paid his employees, of whom he had several thousand, wages that were many times higher than what they usually received for their work. Sometimes, the pay increase was as high as 300%. El Mexicano would award his best workers with visas or starting capital for a move to start a better life in the States, if they so desired. At Pacho, Gonzalo loved to throw parties for the common people, with plenty of free food and drink. And on Christmas, he always gave people clothes and other necessities of life. Folks like Gacha were frequently called magicos, as they often walked around with a black suitcase in their hand and seemed to make money out of practically thin air. One day, a homeowner heard a knock on his door. Opening it, he saw a young man about 25 years old standing by his entryway, hung with gold and diamonds. The guest politely inquired whether it was possible to buy the house. Not wanting to sell, and not taking the fellow seriously, the owner jokingly replied that he would ask for no less than $1 million. The guest immediately gave him the suitcase and asked the owner to count it. Such transactions were commonplace, and the payment was always much higher than the real cost of the item being purchased. There were cases when Gonzalo personally distributed money to passers-by and gave gifts to children, like guns that shot corks. When Popayan, a city in western Colombia, was hit by a devastating earthquake, killing 267 people, Gacha provided enormous social and financial assistance to both the affected people and the site of the tragedy. El Mexicano tried to create the impression of an honest, noble, and pleasant gentleman who wouldn't hurt a fly, and many considered him as such. Gacha allocated millions of drug dollars to community improvement projects, provided jobs to numerous people, and boosted the local economy. His friend Pablo Escobar, with whom El Mexicano had a strong, respectful relationship, did approximately the same thing in Medellin. While helping others, Rodriguez Gacha did not forget about himself. Having become rich, El Mexicano began to fanatically buy up land, placing special emphasis on the Middle Magdalena region in the valley, bordering the departments of Antioquia, Boyacá, and Santander, becoming the largest landowners in the country. He also actively bought farms, apartments, houses, commercial establishments, and other real estate, the amount of which over time exceeded 100 and was valued at more than $40 billion. Like all his drug lord partners, Gotcha kept money in numerous banks around the world, but also liked to convert it into tangible materials, buying gold bars, diamonds, gold toilets, gold tableware, crystal porcelain, Persian tapestries, Italian marble, silk, and countless other luxurious items. Eyewitnesses who managed to visit the houses owned by Gotcha said that silver and gold were practically everywhere. Gems.
He weaponized it. Every coastline, border, and trade corridor was a leverage point. He studied how governments fail to communicate, how paperwork gets lost at frontiers, and how legal loopholes create blind spots. His roots didn't evade systems. They threaded the empty spaces the systems themselves created. His invisibility wasn't magic. It was a meticulous compliance with the letter of the law, used against its very spirit. His recruitment strategy was equally brilliant. He didn't hire people like himself. He hired people who were nothing like each other. A customs lawyer in one city, a maritime broker in another, a cold storage manager on a different continent. They all looked like ordinary professionals doing unrelated jobs. None of them knew they were cogs in a much larger machine. The genius wasn't just the list of roles, but the fact that no one knew they were playing one. To keep this intricate machine running, he implemented a principle of constant renewal. Nothing was permanent. Roots, ledgers, identities. They all had a short, tactical half-life. He saw continuity as a disease, something to be eradicated before it could spread. Frequencies changed. Shell companies dissolved. Carriers rotated. By the time any scrutiny matured, it arrived at a corpse. There was no archive, no record. Everything self-expired by design. Investigators chasing him would always find themselves knocking on doors that belonged to no one, calling numbers that no longer rang, and tracking ships that had vanished from all registries. His personal life was just as carefully constructed to leave no trace. He had no public hobbies, no predictable habits, no emotional fingerprints. He avoided places that could become part of an anecdote. His friendships were transactional and temporary, replaced seasonally. He knew that a long memory in others was his greatest enemy. If someone could describe him in detail, that person was quietly removed from his orbit before that description could become a usable portrait. What the world mistook for luck was actually a cold, calculated strategy for being uncatchable. He didn't try to eliminate risk entirely. He simply positioned himself so that any successful strike would hit empty air. Capturing one node didn't mean capturing the network. Losing one corridor didn't stop the flow. The structure held firm precisely because there was no center to attack. He had distributed the center into dust. His absence was the system. His finances mirrored his logistics. Money was never allowed to sit still. He moved capital just like he moved cargo, through jurisdictions that contradicted each other, through asset classes that weren't cross-reported, and through legal structures that changed the moment they were examined. His wealth wasn't in a location, it was in the momentum. Auditors were always one step behind, arriving to find balances that only existed in the past tense. Eventually, the question stopped being, who is he? And became, does he even exist? The man had become his method. His name was irrelevant. Investigators were left chasing a shape that dissolved the moment they tried to grasp it. And that was his true invention. Not the goods he moved or the routes he created, but the dissolution itself. He had transformed a continental-scale enterprise into something that, on paper, simply could not be said to exist. He had achieved the ultimate paradox, a presence defined entirely by its absence. By the time his name first surfaced in the sealed rooms of intelligence agencies on 3 continents, the man himself was already gone. Not gone in the sense of having fled, but gone in the sense of having pre-subtracted his own future. He had built an entire life on a principle of forward-tilted anticipation. He didn't react to pressure. He pre-erased the very surfaces an attack could land on before that pressure could even form. Investigators believed they were closing in. They felt the thrill of the hunt, the satisfaction of connecting dots. What they didn't know was that every door they approached, every lead they followed, was structurally designed to be the wrong one. They were chasing decoys, illusions meticulously placed to die under scrutiny. Also, the real arteries of his operation could remain unseen. He wasn't ahead of the chase in distance. He was ahead in pure logic. He understood how an investigator thinks, what lines of inquiry seem most plausible, and he laid his traps of illusion exactly where that plausibility would lead them. It was a masterpiece of misdirection. Inside his own organization, the climate was governed by rules no one knew existed. There were no oaths of loyalty, no written codes of conduct, no secret handshakes. There were only consequences, built directly into the architecture of the system itself. To work for him was to operate inside a machine whose gears were silent and whose teeth were invisible. People followed the correct patterns, not because they were ordered to, but because any deviation from those patterns produced immediate friction in their own self-interest. He had replaced the need for obedience with a kind of engineered alignment. You did the right thing simply because the design of the system made any alternative completely irrational. In his world, power didn't need to shout. It made the walls themselves do the talking. To the outside world, his frequent disappearances looked casual. He was just a man who travels a lot, a businessman with a global portfolio. In reality, these were not trips, they were evacuations, synchronized to signals so subtle they were practically invisible. An inquiry opened under seal at a distant port authority, an unexplained request for a conference in a foreign ministry, a tiny statistical anomaly in cargo scanning rates halfway across the world. To anyone else, this was just noise, the random static of global commerce. To his trained eye, these were tremors. Where others waited for a formal warning, he moved on the faintest vibration. He could feel risk before risk even had a name. His personal sense of time was uniquely elastic. He could freeze an entire shipping route for 2 years without a hint of impatience, then revive it under a completely new banner with none of its past traceability intact. Most of his rivals were addicted to speed, to constant motion. He, however, treated velocity as a dangerous drug, one that blurs discipline and exposes the perimeter. For him, slowness was armor. His pauses were not periods of inactivity. They were periods of incubation. In these quiet intervals, paperwork aged into irrelevance, memories decayed, key witnesses drifted away, and the relentless glare of law enforcement reallocated itself to louder, more obvious targets. In his grand strategy, silence did more work than motion ever could. Even in his most private moments, he curated an atmosphere of opacity. He never spoke in declarative sentences that could be quoted back later. His communication was a dance of conditionals, of reversible clauses, of deniable half-statements that lacked any solid semantic anchor. If you tried to recall his words, you would remember the tone, the implication, but never the substance. In rooms where multi-million-dollar deals were struck, he left behind no sentences that could survive as evidence, not even in a person's memory. His language was designed to self-delete the moment it was heard. What outsiders often misread as charisma was actually a much rarer, much more potent faculty. Informational asymmetry, weaponized without any theatrics. He never out-argued anyone. He simply out-knew them. People complied with his wishes not because he compelled or threatened them, but because he had already pre-calculated their constraints, their needs, and their fears. He then offered them a solution that made any form of resistance seem illogical. For him, influence wasn't about persuasion. It was about presenting a polite, well-reasoned version of inevitability. Yet, as his architecture of influence stretched further and further, across oceans, climates, currencies, and complex legal systems, a central question began to ossify. Could something this large, this intricate, truly remain invisible forever without an eventual catastrophic rupture? He had built his entire world to defend against exposure from his enemies. But in complex systems, exposure doesn't always come from a deliberate attack. It can emerge from simple entropy. A random audit, a stray comment from a disgruntled employee, a low-level bureaucrat with too much time on his hands, a journalist with absolutely nothing to lose. His genius had insulated him from every engineered threat imaginable. But could it nullify pure, dumb randomness? He knew the answer. He understood this vulnerability better than anyone. And that is why he built his endgame directly into the midgame. His exit wasn't planned as a single, dramatic event. It was designed as a gradient, a slow fade. Long before anyone even knew where to look for him, he had already started retracting his presence, segment by silent segment. He made his absence accumulate in tiny, slow increments that were too small to trigger any alarms. From the outside, It looked like the machine was still running at full capacity, under his firm grip. In reality, the machine was running on sheer inertia, while his shadow was quietly stepping out of the frame. The enterprise he built remained visible. It had a name, offices, assets. But the operator, the ghost in the machine, had already evaporated. By the time the first credible intelligence inquiry finally pointed toward the right hemisphere of his operations, his fingerprints had long been vacuum-sealed into history. What the world was now chasing was the ghost of a structure, a scaffolding he had deliberately left behind to be blamed, studied, litigated, and eventually dismantled. It was the perfect final decoy. All the while, the architect himself had already migrated into a new phase of existence, a state for which we don't even have a name. His greatest move was not in building his vast, invisible network. It was in leaving it, without ever leaving a void for anyone to find. Have you ever wondered how someone could simply vanish from the face of the earth? Not in a puff of smoke, but so slowly, so meticulously, that no one even noticed they were leaving. Long before any investigation began, before his name was even whispered in the halls of power, he was already planning his exit. Most people only think about escape when the walls are closing in. He, on the other hand, engineered his disappearance while he was still at the peak of his power, completely untouchable. The proof that true invisibility can be manufactured, and that erasure, if architected early enough and executed with patience, is a force more powerful than fame, fear, or even governments. And so, a riddle persists, echoing in the void he left behind. Who was the man who trafficked in continents? But now on its own momentum, on institutional habit, not on his direct command. To an observer, the constant activity looked like he was still in control. But in reality, his signature, his will, had already been removed from the equation. His body was still there, a ghost in the machine, allowing his mind to slip away undetected. Next, he tackled his narrative. He understood that to be truly gone, he had to stop being a character in anyone else's story. People who were once close to him, who could speak with authority about who he was, were slowly rotated out. Their memories of him were diluted by time and deliberate misdirection. He knew a person doesn't truly exit public life when they are physically gone, but when no one is left who can reliably describe them. He transformed himself from a living, breathing person into an unquotable fact, a historical footnote that was present once, but could no longer be brought to life through speech or memory. Then came his personal life, rewritten so quietly no one heard the edits. His home, his language, the very rhythm of his speech, his financial footprint, his social identity, each was altered. Not overnight, but fractionally, like a face aging 1 millimeter at a time, so gradual it's unnoticeable in the moment. We assume disappearance is a sharp cut, a sudden break. He proved that disappearance can look like seamless continuity, as long as the change is gradual enough. By the time anyone had a reason to look back and trace his steps, there was no single point of divergence, no switch on the tracks to show where he'd changed course. The trail forward had been erased before it was even fully formed. And what about his wealth? That too was insulated from his biography. He didn't chase luxury. Luxury creates witnesses and leaves a trail. He sought something far more powerful: irreversibility. His capital was reformatted, poured into complex legal structures and entities that were designed to outlive him as an individual. The fortune was no longer his. It became a series of legal fictions, governed by the cold, impersonal friction of international law, not by the fragile identity of one man. When investigators eventually found the accounts, they were met with a puzzle, not a prize. An account without an owner is a mathematical problem, not a capture. He had successfully severed the link between his prosperity and his personhood. While he was methodically erasing himself, the story of his rise began to twist and distort on its own. In the black market of rumor and speculation, each retelling added new contradictions. Who was he really? Where did he come from? What did he truly control? Over time, this web of contradictions became his ultimate shield. A figure who cannot be clearly described, cannot be condemned in the court of public opinion. He used myth, not secrecy, to complete his vanishing act. When a person becomes a rumor that large, that inconsistent, they cease to be a target. They become a category, an abstract concept. Years later, when governments and agencies finally pooled their resources to assemble a timeline of his life and operations, what they found was not clarity, but an afterimage, a ghost. They could reconstruct the corridors of his empire, but not the command center. They found the structures he had built, but not the architect. They could prove he existed, but only in the past tense. The trail wasn't cold. It had been engineered to go cold before the first investigator ever took a step. In the end, he achieved the ultimate paradox. A man who once wove together continents with invisible threads of power succeeded not through dominance, but through reduction. He systematically removed himself from the board before history could pin him down. His true legacy wasn't the global network he built, but the proof embedded in its silent dissolution. The proof that a system can span the globe without a central target to strike. The proof that true invisibility can be manufactured, and that erasure, if architected early enough and executed with patience, is a force more powerful than fame, fear, or even governments. And so, a riddle persists, echoing in the void he left behind. Who was the man who trafficked in continents? And how did his entire route vanish from the radar, without anyone noticing when the vanishing even began?
The case may be closed, but criminology never sleeps. Like and subscribe at Join Criminology, and step deeper into the dark with us.